A suitcase hit the front porch and burst open. Clothes scattered across wet concrete. A hand shoved hard between her shoulder blades. An old woman stumbled forward and caught the railing. Behind her, the front door slammed shut. A deadbolt turned. Then a chain slid into place. She stood there in a housecoat and slippers, breathing hard, staring at a door that used to be hers. 2 crumpled dollar bills sat in her palm. That was everything. No phone, no wallet, no keys. Not a single person on that whole street looked twice. Her name was Eleanor Hayes. She had raised 3 children behind that door, and her own son had just thrown her out like something expired. What Eleanor did in the next 48 hours didn't just save her life. It cracked open a secret her mother had buried for half a century. Stay with me on this one. Eleanor didn't cry. That's the first thing you need to understand about this woman. She was 72 years old, and she had been through enough that crying wasn't even in the toolbox anymore. She stood on that porch for a full minute, looking at the door. Then she bent down, stuffed whatever clothes she could grab back into the broken suitcase, and started walking. No plan, no destination, just one foot in front of the other down a suburban street in eastern Pennsylvania on a Tuesday afternoon. People drove past. A neighbor pulled into a driveway across the street, looked at her, and went inside. Nobody stopped. Now here's how she ended up on that porch. 8 years earlier, Eleanor's husband Frank had died. Heart attack. Dropped dead in the garage on a Saturday morning while changing the oil on his truck. Frank had handled the money. All of it. The bills, the taxes, the savings. Everything went through Frank. And when the dust settled after the funeral, Eleanor found out there wasn't any money to handle. The house had a second mortgage she didn't know about. Credit cards she'd never seen. Debts going back years. Within 6 months, the bank took the house. The car followed. Then the furniture. Eleanor walked out of that foreclosure with 2 suitcases and a box of photo albums. That was it. Her son, David, the oldest, said she could move in with him and his wife, Karen. David said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. His mother needed a place. He had a spare room. Done. And for a while it worked. Eleanor cooked. She cleaned. She picked up the grandkids from school and helped them with homework. She made herself useful because she understood the deal. You live in someone else's house, you earn your keep. You stay quiet. You take up as little space as possible. Eleanor had spent a lifetime learning how to do exactly that. But over 8 years, the math changed. The grandkids grew up and got their licenses. They didn't need rides anymore. They had their own friends, their own schedules, their own lives that didn't include a grandmother sitting in the living room watching game shows. The house felt smaller than it used to. Karen started talking about renovations. A new kitchen. Finished basement. A deck out back. Money got tighter. And that's when the comments started. Little ones at first. Karen would mention the water bill and glance at Eleanor. She'd sigh about grocery costs while putting things away. She'd say things like, "It's amazing how much 3 people eat compared to 2. Eleanor heard every single word. She just never responded. She'd been quiet her whole life. Quiet through a marriage that wasn't easy. Quiet through a childhood that wasn't easy either. Quiet was what she knew. But Karen's comments got louder. By year 7, they weren't comments anymore. They were conversations that happened in the bedroom between David and Karen, loud enough for Eleanor to hear through the wall. Karen said the house was too crowded. She said they couldn't afford a new roof with a 3rd adult eating through the budget. She said Eleanor needed to go to a facility, a home, somewhere with people her own age. David never raised his voice. Not once. He never argued. He never defended his mother. He just let Karen talk until she was done. And then he agreed. The morning it happened, Eleanor was sitting at the kitchen table eating toast. Karen walked in, put both hands flat on the counter, and said she wanted to talk. She said they'd looked into some options. Senior living, assisted care. She had brochures. She pushed them across the table. Eleanor didn't touch them. She looked at David. He was standing by the coffee maker with his back turned. He didn't move. He didn't speak. Karen said the timeline was the end of the month. Eleanor said she understood. She got up from the table, left her toast half-eaten, and went to her room. She started packing. It didn't take long. She didn't have much. But Karen didn't wait until the end of the month. By noon, she was at the bedroom door saying the timeline had moved up. A friend of hers had called about a facility that had an opening right now, today. David stood behind her, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor. Eleanor asked for one more day. Karen said no. And when Eleanor didn't move fast enough, Karen grabbed the suitcase, carried it to the front porch and dropped it. The latch broke. The suitcase popped open. That was the moment. That was the shove. That was the deadbolt. And that's how a 72-year-old woman ended up on a porch with a busted suitcase and $2. The $2 had been in her housecoat pocket from a trip to the corner store the week before. Change from a loaf of bread. That was her entire net worth on this earth. She walked 11 blocks to a bus station. Her slippers weren't meant for that kind of walking. By block 6, the left sole had peeled half off. She sat on a metal bench and looked at the route board. Now here's the thing. Eleanor had grown up in a different state. A small town in upstate New York called Carver Falls. She'd left when she was 18. Got on a bus then, too. Went south. Got married. Had kids. Built a life that looked fine from the outside. She never went back to Carver Falls. Not for holidays. Not for funerals. Not even when her mother died 34 years ago. Her mother, Ruth Ainsley, had passed alone in a cottage on the edge of town. Pneumonia. Winter. No one found her for 3 days. The cottage was sealed after the funeral per Ruth's will. That will had been specific. Seal the cottage. Don't sell it. Don't rent it. Don't open it. Eleanor had always thought that was strange. But she'd had her own life by then. A husband who needed dinner on the table. 3 kids in school. She told herself she'd deal with the cottage someday. And someday never came. Until now. A Tuesday afternoon at a Greyhound station with $2 in her hand. A one-way ticket to the closest stop cost $1.90. Eleanor bought it. She had 10 cents left. She sat in the back of the bus with the suitcase between her knees and her hands folded in her lap. 6 hours. No food. No water. No phone to call anyone, even if she'd had someone to call. The woman next to her fell asleep within 10 minutes. A man across the aisle ate a sandwich and didn't offer any. Eleanor didn't expect him to. She wasn't the kind of person people noticed, and she'd made peace with that a long time ago. She watched Pennsylvania flatten and then fold into the hills of New York. The towns got smaller. The spaces between them got wider. By the time the sun started going down, she could smell pine through the cracked window. The bus pulled into a gas station on a 2-lane road outside Carver Falls. She hadn't been here since she was a teenager. Nothing looked familiar except the mountains. The main street was half empty, storefronts boarded up. A diner that had changed names 3 times. She asked the gas station clerk for directions to the old Ainsley property. The clerk shrugged. A woman pumping gas overheard and pointed her east. Past the grain elevator. Past the old school. Down a gravel road along a creek. Eleanor walked for 40 minutes. Her slippers shredded on the gravel. Her feet bled. But she kept going because there was nowhere else on this planet for her to go. And then she saw it. Past an overgrown field, behind a rusted iron gate that had collapsed on one side. There it was. Her mother's cottage. Small. Stone foundation. Wooden frame. A tin roof gone brown with rust. The windows were shuttered from the inside. The front door had 2x4s nailed across it in an X pattern. Sealed. Just like the will said. Eleanor pushed through the broken gate. Weeds came up past her waist. The porch steps groaned under her weight. She stood at the front door and stared at those boards. They'd been nailed there 34 years ago. She didn't have a hammer. She didn't have tools of any kind. But she found a loose piece of iron railing from the collapsed gate and used it as a pry bar. Took her 20 minutes. Her palms tore open. Blood ran down the railing. But one by one, the boards came free. The door behind them was unlocked. She turned the knob and it opened. Now here's what she expected. Decay. Mold. A collapsed ceiling. Rats. 34 years of rot and abandonment. That's what happens to a house that nobody touches for 3 decades. But that's not what she found. She stepped inside and stopped. The air was cool and still, dry. No mildew smell. No animal droppings. No cobwebs. The furniture was covered in white sheets, like ghosts standing guard in every room. She pulled one off. Underneath, a wooden chair. Clean. No dust. No rot. She pulled off another sheet. A kitchen table. Polished maple. Intact. Not a scratch on it. She ran her hand across the surface and felt wax. Someone had waxed this table before covering it. She walked into the kitchen. Jars lined the shelves. Preserves. Pickled beets. Green beans. Sealed tight with wax. She opened a cabinet. Dishes stacked neatly. Glasses without a single crack. A cast-iron skillet hanging from a nail, still seasoned black. She opened the drawer by the sink. Her mother's kitchen scissors were right where they'd always been. The whole cottage looked like someone had walked out yesterday, not 34 years ago. The walls hadn't sagged. The floor hadn't buckled. The stone foundation had held everything together like a fist. It made no sense, but it was real. And Eleanor wasn't about to question a miracle. Eleanor stood in the middle of her dead mother's kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt in 8 years. Maybe longer. Safe. The cottage was solid. The roof didn't leak. The well pump out back still worked when she primed it. She drank cold water from a tin cup that had sat in the same spot on the counter since she was a girl. She sat at the kitchen table and just breathed. For the first time since Frank died, she wasn't in anyone's way. She wasn't asking permission to exist. She wasn't waiting to be told to leave. She found blankets in a cedar chest. She made a bed on the old couch. She ate canned peaches from her mother's shelf. 34 years in a sealed jar, and they were still sweet. Eleanor closed her eyes and slept deeper than she had in a decade. The kind of sleep where you don't dream because your body finally trusts where it is. She woke up the next morning to sunlight cutting through the shutters. She opened them one by one. The cottage filled with warm, gold light. And that's when she saw it. On the mantel above the fireplace, half hidden behind a framed photograph, was an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax, her name written on the front in her mother's careful handwriting. Eleanor. Just that. Nothing else. She picked it up, held it for a long time. Then she broke the wax and opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages. It started with 3 words. I knew you'd come. And everything changed. Ruth's letter didn't start with apologies. It didn't start with love or regret. It started with instructions. Go to the cellar. The lock combination is your birthday. Month, day, year. Open the door. Everything you need is below. Eleanor found the cellar hatch in the pantry, under a braided rug she remembered from childhood. The padlock was old but solid brass. She turned the dial. Her birthday. October 14th, 1953. 1, 0, 1, 4, 5, 3. Clicked open on the first try. She pulled the hatch and descended wooden stairs into a cool, dark room that smelled like earth and cedar. What she found down there. Believe me, this is where the whole story turns. The cellar was organized. Shelves along every wall. Not jars of food. Not old tools. Documents. Boxes of them. Manila folders. Leather binders. A filing system that looked like it belonged in a law office, not under a farmhouse. Labels on every box. Written in Ruth's hand. Land. Trust. Taxes. Legal. Personal. Each label in block letters. Each box sealed with packing tape that had yellowed but held firm. Eleanor pulled the first box off the shelf, the one labeled land, and brought it into the kitchen light. Inside were deeds. Land deeds. Not just for the cottage and its quarter-acre plot. Deeds for 42 acres of surrounding land. Fields to the north. Forest to the west. Creek frontage along the entire eastern boundary. All of it in Ruth Ainsley's name. All of it legally recorded and notarized at the county clerk's office. All of it, according to the tax records filed in the same box, paid up through 2027. Paid. Every single year. Someone had been making those payments. Quietly, faithfully. For decades, Eleanor checked the receipts. The payments came from a trust account at a bank in Albany. She opened the second box. Trust. Bank statements going back to 1971. A trust account opened with an initial deposit of $5,000. Monthly contributions after that. Small at first. $25. $50. Then larger as the years went on. $200 a month by the 80s. $500 by the 90s. The most recent statement, printed 6 months ago and mailed to the Pearson law firm, showed a balance of $412,000. Interest had compounded. Dividends had reinvested. The money had sat there, growing quietly, like a tree nobody was watching. Stop and think about that. 24 hours earlier, this woman was standing on a porch with 2 crumpled bills and nowhere to go. Her own son had thrown her out. She'd ridden a bus with no food and walked on bleeding feet to a house she thought was abandoned. And underneath her mother's kitchen floor, sealed behind a combination lock only she could open, was more than $400,000 and 42 acres of land. But the money wasn't even the biggest shock. There was a third box, smaller than the others, wrapped in cloth. No label. Eleanor unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a single document in a protective plastic sleeve. A birth certificate. Eleanor's birth certificate. But not the one she'd grown up with. Not the one that listed Harold Hayes as her father. This certificate had been issued by a different county. And the father line read, James Whitfield. Eleanor's hands shook. She set the document down on the table and stepped back from it like it was something hot. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. Because what comes next rewrites everything Eleanor ever believed about her life. Eleanor didn't know James Whitfield. Not personally. But she knew the name. Everyone in Carver Falls knew the Whitfield name. The Whitfield family had owned the largest dairy operation in the county for 3 generations. They'd built the town library. They'd funded the fire department. James Whitfield had been the patriarch. Old money. Church every Sunday. A man whose handshake could get a loan approved or a road paved. He died in 1992. His obituary ran on the front page of 3 newspapers. Eleanor went back to the letter. Page 2. Her mother's handwriting, steady and clear. James and I were together for 2 years before you were born. He was already married. He had a family, a name to protect. When I told him I was pregnant, he offered to pay. I said no. He offered to take you and raise you as his own. I said no to that too. I wasn't going to let my daughter grow up as someone's secret. He didn't push, but he set up the trust. He bought the surrounding land and put it in my name. He said it was for you when the time came. I sealed the cottage because I didn't trust his family. If they found out about you after I was gone, they would have taken the land. They would have challenged the trust. They would have buried the truth. So I buried it first, in a place only you could find it. Eleanor read that paragraph 5 times. She read it standing up. She read it sitting down. She read it once more with her hands pressed flat on the table to keep them from shaking. 72 years. She had spent 72 years believing she was the daughter of Harold Hayes. A factory worker who drank too much, yelled too much, broke things when he was angry, and walked out when she was 7 without a word or a forwarding address. That story had shaped everything. Her tolerance for bad situations. Her silence in rooms where she should have spoken. Her willingness to be small, to shrink, to accept whatever space other people decided to give her. Harold Hayes was a ghost that had haunted every decision she'd ever made. And now, sitting at her mother's kitchen table in a sealed cottage in a town she'd run from at 18, she learned he wasn't her father at all. The lie wasn't cruel. It was a wall her mother had built around her. And it had held for half a century. But here's the thing. The Whitfield family was still in Carver Falls. James was dead, but his legitimate children were alive and active. 2 sons and a daughter. They ran what was left of the dairy and had expanded into real estate development. They were, in fact, the same people who had been trying to buy the land around the cottage for years. Eleanor found the evidence in a 4th box. Letters. Purchase offers. Sent to the estate of Ruth Ainsley. Polite at first. then aggressive, then written by lawyers using words like eminent domain and adverse possession, all of them unanswered, all of them returned to sender by a post office that had no forwarding address. The Whitfields didn't know Eleanor existed. They didn't know the land had a living heir. They thought they were dealing with a dead woman's unclaimed property, and they had been circling it like patient animals for years, waiting for it to default into county hands where they could buy it for nothing. Eleanor climbed out of the cellar and sat at the table with everything spread in front of her. She had two choices. She could take the money, sell the land quietly, and disappear into a comfortable retirement somewhere no one would bother her. Or she could do what her mother never did. She could walk into town, find a lawyer, and claim her name. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her mother's chair by the fireplace and thought about Ruth, about what it must have cost to keep that secret for so many years, about the discipline it took to seal a house and trust that someday, decades later, the right person would open it. By morning, Eleanor had made her decision. She chose to claim it. The lawyer's office was a converted house on Main Street. The sign said Pearson and Kessler. Eleanor had found the business card in her mother's documents. It was old and soft at the edges, but the firm was still there. The original Pearson was long retired. His son, Tom, now ran the practice. He was in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, quiet hands. He looked at Eleanor like she was someone he'd been expecting in a dream when she walked through his door, barefoot, carrying a box of documents under her arm. She told him who she was. She showed him the deeds, the trust statements, the birth certificate, the letter. Tom Pearson sat behind his desk for a long time without speaking. Then he opened a drawer. He pulled out a file, his own file, thick, dog-eared. His father had been Ruth Ainsley's attorney for 40 years. He had helped set up the trust with James Whitfield. He had paid the property taxes every year from the trust account per Ruth's standing instructions. He had been waiting. His father had told him, before he died, that someone would come for that file. He didn't know when, Tom said. He just said to be ready. The legal process took 5 weeks. Tom filed paperwork to establish Eleanor as rightful heir to the land, the cottage, and the trust. The birth certificate was authenticated by the state. Ruth's will, held in the Pearson firm's vault since 1991, was unsealed for the first time. It named Eleanor as sole beneficiary, and it included one additional item Eleanor hadn't known about: a handwritten letter from James Whitfield himself, dated 1988, 4 years before his death. In that letter, James acknowledged Eleanor as his biological daughter. He affirmed the trust. He asked that she be allowed to inherit in peace. That letter was everything, because within 2 weeks of the filings hitting county records, the Whitfield family found out. And they came hard. 3 attorneys from a firm in Albany. They filed challenges to the deeds. They challenged the authenticity of the birth certificate. They said Ruth Ainsley had forged the documents. They said James Whitfield had been manipulated by a woman who wanted his money. They filed a motion to freeze the trust and another motion to have Eleanor declared mentally incompetent on the grounds that she was a homeless woman with no verifiable identity making outlandish claims. That's the word they used. Outlandish. Tom Pearson fought every one of them. He filed responses, affidavits, exhibits. He brought in a handwriting expert who confirmed James Whitfield's letter was genuine. He pulled county records showing the trust payments going back 50 years. He produced his own father's notes from meetings with both Ruth and James. Every piece of evidence Ruth had stored in that cellar was authentic. Every piece told the same story. Eleanor sat in Tom Pearson's office through every single hearing. She wore a dress she'd bought at a thrift store in town. She sat up straight. She didn't flinch when the Whitfield attorneys called her a fraud. She didn't flinch when they suggested she'd broken into the cottage and planted the documents herself. She answered every question with the same steady voice she'd used her whole life. The voice of a woman who had learned, a long time ago, how to take a hit without going down. The Whitfield children themselves never came to court. They sent their lawyers. They sent their money. But they never sat in that room and looked Eleanor in the eye. And maybe that told you everything you needed to know about them. And their father's own letter destroyed them. Handwritten. notarized, witnessed by the elder Pearson. It held up under every challenge. The judge ruled in Eleanor's favor on all counts. The land was hers. The trust was hers. The cottage was hers. And the truth, Eleanor's truth, was now a matter of public record. Eleanor didn't celebrate. She didn't call David. She didn't hold a press conference. She went back to the cottage, sat at the kitchen table, and cried. For the first time in years. Not because she was sad. Because she finally understood what her mother had done. Ruth Ainsley had been a young woman with no power and no resources, facing a family that could have taken her child. And instead of fighting a fight she couldn't win, she built a quiet fortress. She bought land with money James gave freely. She saved every penny she could. She sealed a cottage like a time capsule. And she waited, not for herself. She would never see the inside of that cottage again. She waited for Eleanor. For the day the world would push her daughter to the very edge, and she'd need a door that no one else could lock. That's not stubbornness. That's not paranoia. That's a kind of love so patient it outlasts the person who carries it. Eleanor used the trust to restore the cottage. New roof, new plumbing, a proper kitchen with a gas stove and a refrigerator that hummed quietly in the corner. She had the stone foundation repointed by a local mason who charged her half his usual rate because he said any daughter of Ruth Ainsley deserved a fair deal. She had the well tested and the water certified clean. She had electricity run out from the road for the first time. But she kept the tin cup on the windowsill. She kept the jars of preserves on the shelf, even the empty ones. She kept her mother's chair by the fireplace and sat in it every evening while the light went down behind the mountains. She didn't sell the land. Not to the Whitfields. Not to developers. Not to anyone who came asking, and several did. She leased 20 acres to a local farmer who grew hay and kept a few head of cattle. She donated 5 acres to the town for a community garden that opened the following spring. She kept the rest wild. The creek still ran through it, cold and clear. Deer moved through the trees at dusk. Red-tailed hawks circled in the afternoons. It was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with peace. She called David once, 3 months after the court ruling. Not to yell, not to forgive, just to tell him she was alive and where she was. The call lasted 90 seconds. He said he was glad she was okay. She said she knew. That was it. She didn't invite him to visit. She didn't close the door either. She just left it where it was. Some things don't get fixed. They just get carried differently. But her grandchildren, that was different. 2 of them, teenagers now. They had their own phones, their own lives, their own quiet guilt about what had happened to their grandmother. They had been in the house that morning. They had heard the shouting. And neither of them had done a thing about it. The younger one, a girl named Rose, texted Eleanor one evening. Just a simple message. "Grandma, are you okay?" Eleanor wrote back, "I'm better than okay. Come see for yourself." Rose drove up on a Saturday with her boyfriend. 6 hours in a used Honda with bad shocks. She knocked on the cottage door, and Eleanor opened it. And they stood there looking at each other for a long moment before either one spoke. Rose was the one who cried. Eleanor held her on the porch and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Then she brought her inside and made her lunch from the garden. Tomatoes, basil, bread she'd baked that morning in the oven Ruth had cooked on 50 years before. She told Rose about Ruth, about the cellar, about the letters and the trust and the Whitfields and the birth certificate that changed everything. Rose listened to every single word. She asked questions, good ones. And when she left that evening, she hugged Eleanor at the gate and said, "I'm coming back." She meant it. Eleanor told Tom Pearson something near the end of that first year in the cottage. She said, "My mother didn't leave me a house. She left me a second chance." And she was right, because what started as exile became a homecoming. What started with $2 and a broken suitcase became an inheritance. Not just land, not just money, an inheritance of understanding. The kind of love that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't need to be thanked, that just shows up, decades after the person who planted it is gone, exactly when you need it most, hidden in a cellar, sealed in an envelope, waiting for you to come home. Eleanor Hayes is 73 now. She lives in the cottage. She grows tomatoes and basil in a garden behind the house. She reads on the porch in the evening while the light fades over the mountains. The tin cup sits on the windowsill. Some mornings, she picks it up, turns it in her hands and sets it back down. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't have to. Some things don't need words. They just need to be held.